All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy 2022. This is our first webinar of this year and excited to have everyone on. Today, we're going to be talking about food safety gap versus FSMA. And we're part of the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture Network. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors as well as collaborators of this program. And we have webinars now scheduled pretty much through the entire year, at least a full 6 months. So you can go to that blue link if you'd like to see others that are happening and their descriptions. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the presentation over to Sarah Everhart, who will be presenting on food safety today.
Thanks, Shannon. Let me just get this pulled up.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks for hopping on this today. I am happy to take questions as we go. Shannon can interrupt me if she sees something in the chat, or if you all want to interrupt me, go ahead. I'm totally fine with being interrupted. Probably a question that everybody has if you have it. If we've never met before, I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. We are a group of attorneys. We provide legal education and outreach throughout the state of Maryland. So we focus on just about any legal issue you can think of that impacts farmers. So, one day we'll be out talking with folks about environmental compliance. Next day we'll be in a different part of the state talking to people about labor law. If you've never checked out our resources, I'll give you a little bit more information about that. Today I'm here with a different hat on. I'm also part of the Maryland Food Safety Network. So we've got a great network of folks throughout the state, as you can see here, that work for the Maryland Department of Agriculture, University of Maryland College Park, and University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And so we all work together to provide food safety outreach. So if you ever have any food safety concerns, questions, want some assistance, want somebody to come out to your farm, please don't hesitate, because we got a lot of folks on our team who are here and willing to help. So here is the ALEI website. If you've never checked it out, I encourage you to check it out. We try to keep it up to date with upcoming events, and all of our legal resources are housed here on this website. We've got a lot of easy to read, kind of explanatory educational resources about different legal topics. So we try to break things down without using legalese in plain English and explain, a lot of the different legal issues that you all will be facing. And if you have an issue and you don't see something on our website, please let us know. We're happy to look into it and create something. And most of our resources came from just that, from folks reaching out and explaining to us that they had an issue. You can also call our legal info line. This number, 410-706-7377, rings directly to my cell phone. And happy to chat with folks. We can provide legal advice. I was in private practice for a number of years before I started working for the university, but now we provide legal education and research. So for example, a farmer called me end of last week and had a leasing issue. And I was able to talk to him, give him an attorney referral, and send him the copy of the piece of law that we were specifically talking about having to do with farm leasing. So that's the kind of help we can give you if you give that phone line a call. I'm not providing legal advice today. I'm just providing legal education. And like I said, we can refer you to an attorney if you need one. Happy to do that. But for today, I'm just here giving you some educational information. Like Shannon said, I'm going to be talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically the Produce Safety Rule. Also going to be talking about GAP, Good Agricultural Practices. We have been talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act for a long time over at ALEI. This law has been around for a while. It was actually passed in late 2010, signed into law in 2011. And why we spend so much time talking about it is because it was a big shift legislatively in how the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, deals and responds to food safety outbreaks. So prior to this law, FDA was in a very sort of reactionary status, meaning, when there would be an outbreak, FDA would respond and investigate. The purpose of this law was to change that system from a reactive system to more of a preventative based approach. So trying to prevent those foodborne outbreaks before they even start. So what that really means is right from the source. So it puts a lot of work on farmers, and we understand that, and that's why I'm here today, to try to make sure everybody understands the law and how their farm fits into it. So the Food Safety Modernization Act is a very broad law, as you can imagine, with that sort of ambitious undertaking of trying to prevent foodborne illness outbreaks that, spans the entire food system. So it impacts farmers with the produce safety rule, and then food processing with the preventative controls for human food. And I'll talk a little bit about that, about how farm products could fit in with that rule. And then touches on things like animal food, the transportation of food coming in from other sources into the United States. So there's a lot of pieces of this, very broad. Today, I'm really going to be focusing on the produce safety rule, because that's the part of this that most often impacts farmers. All right, so the produce safety rule is meant to provide science-based standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables. So those are the different parts of the process that, that the rule addresses. And it's a federal law. It depends state by state how the law is administered. Some states like Maryland and Delaware, this law is actually administered through the State Department of Agriculture. So yes, it's a federal law, but most folks find it to be good news that they don't have to deal with the federal government. They can deal with folks they're familiar with at their state regulatory agency. So here's all the different parts of the law. And so if you've ever been to a produce safety training, or if you've been through a good agricultural practices training, these different topics probably look familiar to you. So spans worker health and hygiene. So if you go to a produce safety rule training, which I'll give you throughout the presentation here, some upcoming trainings. We try to hold trainings in the winter when we know farmers are a little bit more flexible typically. And so if you go to a training, you'll hear about all these different topics. The rule is broken down into these different modules, and the whole, the purpose of it is to try to prevent that microbial contamination. And so, as we're all aware, unfortunately, with everything we've all been going through with the global pandemic, workers are, one of the ways that contamination can be spread, human beings on farms. And so worker health and hygiene is addressed in the rule. The use of soil amendments, so the use of compost or animal manure when growing produce, controlling wildlife on the farm, making sure domesticated animals aren't becoming sources of contamination spreading. And then agricultural water is a big part of the produce safety rule. It's broken down into two different parts: water used in the production of food, and then also water used in post-harvest. So things, water and dump tanks and that type of thing. FDA currently is taking another look at the agricultural water part of this rule. So part of this is actually published now and open for public comment because some of the water testing standards that are in the produce safety rule are pretty intense, and we're requiring farmers to do a lot of water testing. So kind of more to potentially come on that. We're keeping our eye on whether or not those water testing standards are going to be tweaked or not. But then finally, equipment, tools, and buildings, so making sure that those areas of the farm where food is, coming in for sort of that last boxing up, putting things in CSA boxes, sorting, that type of thing, making sure that those areas stay clean of contamination too, all those harvest tools as well. There is a whole separate part of the produce safety rule for the production of sprouts. So if anyone's growing sprouts, that's a whole separate thing. Happy to give you more information about that. I'll share my contact information at the end here and we can talk about sprouts. But I'm going to explain a bit in detail who this law applies to, because it's very tricky which farms fit in which categories in terms of this rule. And so I'll try to explain that in the simplest way I know how. In general, I'm sure all of you that are involved in the production of food, your intention is to create safe and healthy food. No farmer wants to grow any food that's going to get anybody sick. So regardless of where your farm fits within the applicability of this rule, it would be great for you to attend a training. And so let's go through here some of the different categories of applicability here so you do understand where you fit. So some growers are completely excluded. So if you're only growing food that's rarely consumed raw, so if you're only growing potatoes, if you're only growing pumpkins, there is a list within the produce safety rule of those different foods that they consider foods that are rarely consumed raw, then this law is not going to be applicable to you. There's also an average annual produce sales cutoff. So if you're a new farmer, if your farm is just kind of getting off the ground and you haven't made that much in gross sales, and I'll give you that number in a minute, you may not be subject to this law yet. And then there's exempt categories as well. So if all the food that you grow is going next to a commercial kill step. So if you're only growing tomatoes that are then going to be canned, you can apply for an exemption from the rule. And then there's also a qualified exempt category, which means most of the law is not going to apply to you. And I'll explain that category as well. But like I said, regardless, even if you're just starting out and this doesn't apply to you yet because of your average gross sales, good idea to come and attend a training. Because of COVID, something positive, a silver lining from COVID is that before COVID, we weren't allowed to have online produce safety rule trainings, and now we are. And the good news about this being a federal law is that it's one standard that everyone in the country is subject to. So if you can't attend one of the trainings that we're having in Maryland, or if you're from Delaware, one of the ones that they're having coming up, you can go online and attend any training anywhere across the country because it's going to be the same information. So if you can attend a Maryland training, it may be helpful for you. We are going to have some folks from the Maryland Department of Ag at all the trainings this year, so they can give you some specific information. But if you can't, that's fine. You'll still get the certificate and you'll still have completed that part of the rule. All growers in Maryland, all produce growers, should be registering with the Maryland Department of Agriculture, even if you only grow things that are rarely consumed raw. Even if you are below the sales cutoff, you still should register with the Department of Ag. So that's a requirement for everybody. Why do you have to register with the Department of Ag? It's going to really help them have the information they need to provide technical assistance and outreach. And it's going to allow them to have enough resources to have the inspectors that they're going to need. The form is fairly simple. It's available on the Maryland Department of Agriculture website. Okay, so hopefully this graphic might help those of you who are visual learners. If you're not not a visual learner, or you can't see this very well, I'll talk it through with you here. So when this rule was passed, the thought was, we know this is going to put a lot of work on farmers that they didn't previously have. And we know that the large farms are going to be better equipped to deal with this law, to take the records that are required in order to be in compliance, and do those, potentially do operational tweaks or upgrade equipment if that's necessary. And so we're going to break this down into categories, and the very large farms, those with over $500,000 in annual produce sales, that's going to be the first group of people that this law applies to, and the entire law is going to apply to those farms. And so the Department of Agriculture in Maryland has started doing some inspections on compliance with this rule, and those are the group of folks that they have started with. They've gone out to the very large farms. And then the very small farms, like I was saying before, those are going to be excluded. And so The wording of the law says farms with less than $25,000 in annual produce sales. However, that number is adjusted for inflation, and those inflation rates are updated in April. So we're still actually dealing with previous inflation rates. And so the previous inflation rates are, right now we're at 28,561. So that is the number that you have to look at to see if you're completely excluded from this law or not. So if you look at your last 3 years of annual produce sales, you average the last 3 years and look at those, you have to decide whether you're above or below that $28,561. If you're somewhere in between those two numbers, which a lot of farms are, then you could potentially be in the qualified exempt category. So here's just a little bit of information about that. If you fall under that annual sales cutoff, there's a form at the Department of Agriculture. They do not want your sales records. All you need to do is fill out a form saying that you've averaged your annual produce sales and you're keeping the forms if they ever want to inspect them at your own operation, and then you just turn in the form. But they don't want to see any of your personal business information. And then just keep in mind that because these are based on 3-year averages, it's a rolling average. So something you got to sit down and look at every year and figure out if you are still exempt or where you fall within the applicability of the rule. Okay, so back to that qualified exempt category, because a lot of folks fall in that middle territory and they want to know more about it. There's 2 parts to fitting in that category. You have to make less than that $500,000 cutoff, but it's a little bit different than it was for the sales cutoff. They look at the value of all the food from the farm from the last 3 years, the sale of all the food from the farm. So before we were talking about produce sales. For this category, you have to look at all food. So if you sell produce and you also grow grain and sell grain, or meat, if you have chickens or livestock or anything like that, that would all count within this food category. So the average annual monetary value of all food from the farm during the 3-year period has to be less than 500,000, and that number is then adjusted for inflation. So then we're at 571,214. And then the second part of that rule is that you have to look at the average annual monetary value of the food sold. So you have to look at all that food and figure out, did I sell the majority of that food to qualified end users? So more than 50% of the average annual monetary value of the food, was it sold to qualified end users versus other types of buyers? What's a qualified end user? A qualified end user is either a consumer or a restaurant or a retail food establishment located in the same state, or not more than 275 miles of the farm. All of this is to say, types of buyers that don't fit into that qualified end user category are, distributors, wholesalers, sort of those middlemen buyers. So if you think you fit within this qualified exempt category, and if you want to fit within this qualified exempt category, and I'll tell you here in a second what you have to do if you want to be in this category, this might be a type of record that most farms previous to the produce safety rule were probably not keeping, right? I know a lot of folks obviously keep track of how much total food you sell every year. And I'm sure you keep track of buyers of your food, but in particular, breaking buyers down between whether they fit within this qualified end user category or whether they don't. That's probably something that most folks were not doing prior to the produce safety rule. But if you want to be qualified exempt, it's something that you need to start doing so that you have the records to prove that you're eligible. So you just need to say, hey, I sell this much percentage of my food to a distributor, and I sell this much to local restaurants or local retail food establishments, or directly to consumers at a roadside stand or farmer's market. So if you're eligible for the qualified exemption, you need to retain records to demonstrate both your total average food sales and, like I just said, that breakdown between the sales to the qualified end users and the total sales. The benefit of being qualified exempt is that you don't need to comply with all the different parts of the produce safety rule. What you need to do is label your food in the way that's required by the rule, and then keep all these records that we've been talking about in order to prove that you're eligible for that exemption. So if you're selling food that a packaging label is required on, so if you're selling something that's going to be sold individually packaged, you have to have a label on that food with the full name and complete business address of the farm, of where that produce was grown. For produce that is not going to be individually packaged, if you're putting it in a crate, that type of thing, or if you're, selling it at the farmer's market unpackaged, then you need to either have a label on the container. So if you're, selling crates of food, you need to have a label on the crate, or a sign at the point of purchase, or a document delivered with the produce with all of that. Oh, sorry about that. With all of that information I just talked about. So the full name and business address of the farm. Some people choose not to be qualified exempt because of those labeling requirements, depending on what you're growing and where you're selling or how you're selling. Some folks say, I don't want to be qualified exempt, and that's totally fine. If you'd rather just comply with the law, in order to comply with the law, you have to attend a produce safety rule training. And it has to be someone from the farm has attended. So the training stays with the person rather than staying with the farm. So if you have, a farm manager who attends the training and then they leave, you need to have somebody else at the farm attend the training. They only have to attend it once, and they have to, keep the records that are required by the law. But that's really sort of the big ask in terms of that. And then, the water testing is probably, one of the more onerous parts of it. But like I said, we're going to see if that ends up to be tweaked a little bit. So if you only grow produce that's going to a kill step, like I explained before, you are not going to be subject to this, but there is a form with MDA that they ask you to fill out, just attesting to that and signing, that is where your food is going. All right, so just to kind of summarize all of that, because I know it's a lot of information. If your operation is not subject to the law, you have to keep records to prove those exemptions or exclusions. And if it is subject to the law, you're going to have to keep the records required by the law to be in compliance. The Department of Ag is starting inspecting farms. Like I said, they started with those big operations, but as the time goes on, they're going to be working their way around the state. So it's a good time now to try to come into compliance, start with registering your farm and attending a training. So we've got some upcoming trainings coming up. I'll give you the dates and locations of those. Another great thing that you can do, because this is a change for a lot of folks, especially if they haven't gone through a good agricultural practices training before, if food safety is, formal food safety education, that's a new thing for the farm. The Department of Agriculture is offering on-farm readiness reviews. And what that really means is a group of folks, typically somebody from Extension. I know Shannon's been involved with these before, folks from the Department of Ag. They'll come out to your farm and they'll basically, walk you through the different parts of the rule and how they think your farm is sort of squaring up in terms of compliance. So, they'll tell you some things that can be improved, and, they'll walk you through with a checklist, things that you could do, little tweaks that you could make, or, investments that you could make for upgrades, that type of thing. And then, they walk away from the farm without any records from that visit. It's not a regulatory audit or anything like that. It's really in the frame of education. I think it's a really good opportunity for farms to interact with the rule, interact with the experts, and be able to come into compliance before the actual inspection from a regulatory agency. If you want some more resources on the produce safety rule, we've got a lot of them on the ALEI food safety page. So we did a webinar series not too long ago where we broke down each of the different modules, and we really talked about specific things about applying the law to your farm. So if you have gone through a training before, but you feel like you want a little bit more information about how the requirements actually should be, implemented on your farm, we've got a number of recorded webinars for that. We've got some things specifically on the records, some tips on record keeping. So check that out if you're interested in that. Are there any questions about FSMA before I move on to good agricultural practices? All right, we'll move on. We'll keep moving. So good agricultural practices and good handling practices. Good agricultural practices, they're farming methods that are going to reduce the likelihood of contaminating produce. So GAP is very similar to the produce safety rule. And as you can see here, these are the different areas that GAP deals with. Very, very similar to the different categories that the produce safety rule touches upon: worker health and hygiene, water quality, compost use, contamination from wildlife. So, the good news is that if you've been through GAP, you'll probably have a much, you'll have a leg up when you go to the produce safety rule training, because those things will probably sound very familiar to you. And we find that sometimes folks get a little bit intimidated by the number of things that are required by the produce safety rule. But if you're already following GAP, you're probably very close to being in compliance already. And then we've got good handling practices, and those are your post-harvest ways to identify and minimize contamination. So water quality, sanitation of the packing house, pest control, sanitation of containers. And so, again, similar things to what are touched upon in the produce safety rule. We do find, although it's a good thing that these two programs are similar, because they are similar, sometimes folks understandably get a little bit confused and think, well, I've gone through GAP, so therefore I don't need to go to the produce safety rule training, or vice versa. So just wanted to highlight some of the differences between the two. So good agricultural practices is voluntary. So the folks that go to those trainings, they're there because they've got buyers that are requiring them to be GAP certified, or they just want to be GAP certified, right? Just sort of a best practice. Produce safety rule training, if the law applies to you, it's going to be mandatory that you attend the training, like I said. GAP is going to require you to create a farm food safety plan. That is going to be the instruction manual for how you're going to minimize those food safety risks. The produce safety rule highly recommends, but does not require you to have a written food safety plan. So very easy to have one food safety plan that you can use for compliance with both of these programs. It's going to be the same plan. You're going to need it for GAP, and you don't need it to be produce safety rule compliant, but it like I said, highly recommended, because it's a really good way to just keep your farm organized and keep everything actually implemented and running properly. For GAP, you're going to need an annual audit to maintain the certification. Produce safety rule does not require any specific audits or inspections. Like I said, the Department of Ag is going to be inspecting farms for produce safety rule compliance, but it's not something that has to be done annually in order to maintain your compliance level. The good news with these is that if you've pursued GAP, like I said, Although these two programs are different, they share a lot of mutuality. And so if you're complying with one, you're well on your way to complying with the other. So this is just a little chart that actually my colleague Angela Forelli created, and I think it's really helpful for folks, kind of breaking down these different categories of food that we typically see coming from farms in our region, and then what parts of these laws and programs are applicable to those different foods. So if you're growing fruits and vegetables that are normally eaten raw, you're, depending on those other facets of things we were talking about previously, you're probably going to be subject to the produce safety rule. Are you eligible for GAP certification? Yes. And you will go through the Maryland Department of Agriculture if you live in Maryland, Delaware Department of Ag if you live in Delaware. Fruits and vegetables not normally eaten raw, you're not going to be subject to that produce safety rule, but you could go for the GAP certification. And again, MDA would be your point of contact in Maryland on that. Value added products with a kill step, that would be something that would fall under the purview of the preventative controls rule. So that was another one of those rules under FSMA. There are training classes for those. I'm happy to help connect anybody if you're creating value-added products on your farm. If you're turning fruit into jelly, making apple cider, that type of thing, you should check out the preventative controls training class. Those products not going to be eligible for a GAP certification, could be covered by the cottage food law in Maryland. Fresh cut produce, once you start cutting up produce and selling it in that cut form, that's considered a form of processing. And so sometimes folks don't realize, something as simple as cutting up produce, that's going to potentially change which of these laws is going to apply to you. So by cutting up the produce, you've then gone into processing, which means you should attend a preventative controls training. For the growing of that produce, you could get that GAP certified, but once it's cut up, that's not going to be under the GAP umbrella anymore. You could be needing a license from the Maryland Department of Health. And then dried vegetables and herbs may be subject to the produce safety rule. So, be in contact with the Maryland Food Safety Network. We can try to help you out with some information about that. That's not going to be something that's subject to GAP. And again, you may need a processing license from the Department of Health. There's a lot of different types of GAP. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as just one GAP program, but there's a GAP program that's created and administered through the Department of Ag, and then there's USDA GAP and good handling practices programs, and there's harmonized and harmonized plus. The good news is that the MDA GAP, USDA harmonized, and the harmonized plus GAP are now all aligned with the produce safety rule. So that wasn't the case a few years ago, but now it is. And so lots of different choices here, but all of these programs are coming together, and hopefully making it easier for farmers to understand and be in compliance. If you would like to take a produce safety rule training this year, we'd love to have you. Good news about these trainings, at this point, they're very affordable. They're subsidized by some funding from the FDA. So they're only $25. That could change in the future. It could become more expensive if that funding's not available. So if you haven't taken it, it's a good time to take it. We are going to have an in-person training on February 17th in Southern Maryland. And we're going to have an online training in March 16th and 17th. We break the online training down into 2 days because nobody wants to be on an 8-hour Zoom. That would be cruel and unusual. So we do break it down over 2 days, and we do it on Zoom, try to make it as interesting as we can. We have a lot of different presenters and things like that. For registration, you can contact me. You can check out the ALEI website. And like I said, if those dates or times don't work for you, you can take any training, any of the online trainings throughout the country. And those are on the Produce Safety Alliance website. So I've given you that link here. And Shannon can, you'll get that when Shannon distributes my slides. That is all that I had prepared today on FSMA and GAP. I'm happy to take any questions that you all have.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. You're welcome to add any questions to the chat pod, any questions that you might have, comments. Feel free to add them to the chat. I think that's a great overview. People starts getting very confused when you talk about food safety. And so I think that was a great way to divide up that information and what's required and how they're similar but different. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pause or stop the recording, and we'll see if any other questions come in.